I am going to go ahead and move on to our next panel discussion, which is about drug review and approval. And we have Dr. Theresa Mullin from the FDA with us today. I am really excited to introduce you guys to Dr. Mullin if you're not familiar with her already. She serves as the Center for the Drug Evaluation and Research Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives. And notably for this community, she oversees areas of strategic interest, including patient-focused drug development and Rare Disease Cures Accelerator. And she really has been, a driving force behind the FDA's efforts in patient-focused drug development. And on a personal note, she is a shero of mine. I feel grateful to have met Dr. Mullin many, many years ago, back when I lived in DC. She was one of the meetings where I just kind of showed up to everything I could in DC. And I was amazed by the poise and the incredible grace that Dr. Mullin brought to her work and to her community engagement, and how she conducted herself with patient advocates. Was just something that I always look up to in how I conduct myself. So Dr. Mullin, I hope you are there. I'm going to try to get your slides going here.
Thank you, Julie. I am, and I'm glad you stopped there. You're going to get me starting to cry before I even start my presentation. So I'm not trying to get it done on time that way. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you and with this Sleep Advocacy Forum meeting today. So thank you so much for having me. And I think that I'm hoping that I can certainly connect my talk to Kristen's talk, which was really just so moving. And Kristen, you were talking about the importance of the story, and some of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try to give you all a quick overview of some of the things we have going on, trying to better integrate the patient's perspective in drug development and regulatory decision making. And I'll just begin by saying, I'm sure that as you all know, FDA doesn't really do a lot of research. We don't actually develop drugs, but we do oversee a lot of the development work, especially clinical trials, and things related to the work that puts together the evidence that's submitted to us in applications and marketing applications. And so in that way, we need to really very well understand what matters to patients. So if you go to the next slide, please, Julie. And so I wanted to begin by saying, well, this is really a key thing that we do, our regulatory decisions related to what drugs can be on the market. And we do this by trying to make an assessment of the benefits and risks associated with that drug. And some basic considerations that we always look at are, we call it the analysis of the condition, and that really has to do with the severity of the condition. Current treatment options refers to the degree to which that disease is adequately or well treated by available therapies. The next area is the benefit the evidence of benefit that's being submitted in the application, and that's the information usually collected in clinical trials. And then what do we know about the risks associated with this medicine? And do the benefits outweigh the risks? Can the risks that are found to be associated with it be managed so that the benefits could outweigh the risks? And there's a certain amount that we know, and there's often a lot we don't know at the time we first get these applications, because the only people who've been studied have been through clinical trials. Next slide, please. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of a sense of how important the patient's perspective is here. First of all, the analysis of the condition. I mean, we can look at, what we know and what's in the medical literature related to the clinical aspects of the condition, but we really need to understand the patient's experience with the disease and what the burdens are for the patient and what the patient perceives as being the most impactful aspects. And to the degree that we don't really know about that, and we haven't found out about that firsthand, we have uncertainty about how well we understand how severe this condition is, how life-changing. And in terms of the treatment options, we need to really understand from the patient's perspective, what are the burdens associated with the administration of currently available treatments, and what aspects of the disease are not even being addressed by those therapies that might be of real great importance to patients. So if we don't understand that, again, we have uncertainty about how relevant and how valuable this will be to the patient. Next slide, please. And another major area is trying to assess the benefits. And so we have the evidence that's been collected in clinical trials, but how relevant are the endpoints that a sponsor is using to what patients care about? Have they found a change that's not only statistically meaningful, but also meaningful to the patient in terms of how much improvement or change there has been for the patient along the lines of what's being measured in that trial? And how can a patient perceive the benefit or assess the benefit when they've been experiencing it? And what's their perspective on a trade-off between benefits and risks? Kristen mentioned a minute ago about adverse effects of drugs. Many drugs have adverse effects that people experience. Not everybody experiences all of the ones that have been reported or observed. But looking at the trade-offs of increased benefit or what benefits are available with the safety risks or the adverse events, and how do patients feel about those trade-offs? Are those acceptable trade-offs, or are they really, is it not worth the trade-off? Next slide, please. So what we realized is that, we really need to hear from patients. I mean, patients are uniquely positioned to really inform us. I mean, they're the ones with the disease. I mean, you might think, well, geez, really it took you that long for the regulator to figure that out? I mean, it's like, but, frankly, I mean, when many of our doctors, our wonderful doctors, are in the clinic and they feel, well, they're having firsthand experience working with patients, usually like every week, they've really got a lot of exposure to that. But what we have found is that, nonetheless, we still need to hear directly from patients about what it's like to live with that disease. What's the burden associated with treatment, and what would they really value in a new treatment? And so we had, before we started this patient-focused drug development program, we had, we still have a patient representative program. That's really helpful, but we can only have a few patients involved in that, and those are always focused on particular matters that have to do with a particular application. So you've got to do conflict of interest screening for the people who are going to be involved in that work. And so that really limits how many people you can talk to. And so these meetings have allowed us to talk to a really wide range of patients, and FDA has been conducting them. And as Julie has sort of mentioned, I mean, we've been conducting them for some years now. We started in 2013. And now as the demand or the value of these meetings really became apparent, and it kind of outstripped FDA's ability to conduct them, we've had a lot of externally led, patient advocacy-led meetings as well. And on the next slide, it gives you just a broad brush sense of the range of conditions. And as you can see, narcolepsy was one of the first that we studied. And we had a tremendous turnout. We worked hard to try to make people aware in the community, because these meetings, and I'll tell you about the format of it, that they're like almost like a town hall, except that only people who really can talk at the meetings, the only ones FDA asks to be speaking at the meeting, are patients and maybe their families if they're helping care for the patient, depending on the disease. And because we're here to listen to what their experiences have been with those very things I just mentioned, what it's like to live with the disease, what are the things that have impacted people most, how has that changed over the course of the time they've had the condition, what are they doing to treat it, how well is that working, what do people worry about, what do they want? And we devote several hours to this, and FDA reviewers are there to listen. Drug companies often come to listen and see what they need to pay more attention to or do in development. And it's been extremely powerful for us. I mean, FDA, first of all, we found very early that we had to provide boxes of tissues everywhere, because people really had told us about, they had the time to really tell us. And what our doctors realized is that they often don't have the time in the clinic to really hear about how it is to live with this disease. And so this was just really a kind of extremely powerful experience for FDA, as well as I think for the other people who came to these meetings. Next slide, please. And so after this time on these meetings, we've certainly everyone's come to realize that patients just really can inform us in a unique way about burden of disease and burden of treatment, these very fundamental questions that we're asking when we're doing our drug reviews. And that, in fact, patients with chronic conditions are actually experts in what it's like to live with that condition. And in an environment where everybody wants to get the expert's opinion and knowledge, key opinion leaders' opinions about things, which is what drug development is usually involves a lot of that kind of input, that patients are experts. And that, in in fact, their chief complaints and the things that matter most are often not explicitly or hadn't always been explicitly factored into drug development. And that these meetings are helpful, but patients actually following these meetings would actually say, well, what else can we do? I mean, this is really good, but this, what else can we be doing? Because we'd like to get some useful drugs. So we try to think about what else. And so in the next slide, it gives you sort of a sense of how we're approaching this. And so we realized that, yes, these qualitative meetings are extremely important and powerful. And in addition to those, though, it would be good to take a progression there to trying to pull out of it and develop endpoints and measures that can capture what patients are identifying that is most important to them and actually could be affected by a therapy, that it might be improved by a medical device or a drug. And so that we could capture better and very good information in clinical trials that would inform our benefit assessment as well as informing our understanding of the clinical context. And so we proceeded to try to lay out what guidances we would need to develop, methodological guidances to achieve that. In the next slide, we just give you a quick overview of these guidance documents, which we're working through them right now, actually. And so the first one is that first one on collecting comprehensive patient and community input on burden of disease and therapy is available in final form now. And the one that follows is in draft guidance on after you've identified sort of this comprehensive set that you want to distill down perhaps a more holistic set of impacts of burden of disease and treatment, and especially those that matter the most to patients. The third guidance builds on that and tries to sort of pull out how can we measure, what kind of clinical outcome assessment measure approach can be used here to best really capture those things that patients are describing. And so this would be in terms of perhaps patient-reported outcome, or maybe an observer-reported outcome, clinician-reported, a performance-based measure may be appropriate, and so on. So you determine what's the best measurement strategy to use. And that fourth guidance is going to be how to take those kind of measures and turn them into endpoints that will be specified in a clinical trial design and would be then submitted for regulatory decision making, and the technologies that could be used to collect that information during trials. Next slide, please. And so the other thing that FDA has been stressing to sponsors, primarily people who, that we regulate, is that they need to be better integrating the patient's perspective at many critical points throughout the drug life cycle, starting early with identifying and making sure they understand what are the impacts of the disease and the burdens of treatment, current treatment that matter most to patients, and thinking about a measurement strategy that's actually going to be a rigorous enough strategy. And then before really going into trials, making sure that your trial designs have had the input of patients who you might want to have enroll in those trials to make them such that patients find them convenient enough, that they're not so burdensome that patients don't want to enroll and they don't want to stay in the trial. So making sure you're consulting patients about trial design. And then the next component here is making sure we at FDA are incorporating this into our decision making in the drug review process. And then finally, how are we going to communicate the results of this and this kind of information to patients and prescribers so that that can inform their decision making in the clinic? Next slide, please. And so the other thing we want to make sure that we can achieve here is some sustainability. I mean, at FDA, we worry a little bit that every drug company is going to go out and reinvent, and do the same collection. And patients have also made very clear to us in all these meetings that they have lives to live. I mean, they want good treatments, but they also don't want to spend their entire life trying to, be helping. They'd like us to not duplicate efforts with them and make because they've got a lot of other things they need to get done in their life. And so we're trying to figure out how to maybe more sustainable here and not reinvent wheels all the time and not have drug companies be repeating work that has already been done and where the community has already given a lot of information. And so we're trying to ensure confidence in the quality and reliability of this information through those guidances. And we're trying to ensure rapid uptake and predictability by training our reviewers and trying to provide training on the guidances as well to others. And the fourth piece is sustaining this and trying to make it standard practice and in development, so that you don't really have to think hard that, gee, should we pull in endpoints that are going to be more meaningful to reflect the patient's perspective, that just becomes something very obvious and standard that people start to do, and that there's good instrumentation available to do it. Next slide, please. So this last piece that FDA's most recent is really what I should say. It's probably not the last at all, but the most recent thing we're undertaking now is we've received some funding through CURES, which is the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016, and Congress called for it. It was an authorizing, but they authorized for us to be appropriated funds for some years going into the future, and it's not every year it needs to be appropriated. But we have some funding for CURES, for patient-focused drug development. And we've been using that funding to really support this new grant program, where we are trying to basically fund very well-qualified or capable instrument developers to essentially start developing instruments that FDA is going to pay for, that we think are very high quality, that we can put in the public domain so that they're available to everybody at little or no cost. And so that, and this is to address this issue of, it can be rather labor intensive to develop good measures. And right now, there's not very much coordination across development of these measures by different groups. And some of the measures available are proprietary tools, and they can be quite expensive to use. Some patient groups have told us, they can't really afford to use them. And so how can we make it high quality and affordable and have a good sets that everybody gets familiar with and can be reused? And so then in this effort, this grant effort, we actually have a science policy board overseeing it as well. And we have CMS, NIH, the VA, we also have the European Medicines Agency and the Japanese agency, PMDA, involved in our science policy board, because we want to both have payers in the US, and we want our regulatory counterparts in other parts of the world to be thinking about this as well, because as we all know, these diseases don't stop at the border, and in fact, most development programs are multinational. So ideally, we'd have similar approaches and standards, throughout or globally, and that will just really facilitate and support and making it a standard practice. And I believe that's my last slide. And the last, actually, one more slide that just has a link on it that takes you to resources that I've associated with the things I've been talking about. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Mullin, for this wonderful presentation. It is so encouraging to hear just how patient-centered the FDA has become. If it took a long time, you're certainly making great headway in a short amount of time. And we're just really, really grateful. I don't know if we have any specific questions, and we can check out the chat. I think we are still running a little bit behind, so we'll maybe just keep going on ahead, but we're just so grateful for your leadership, and personally, thank you so much it's so nice to see you.
It's so nice to see you too, and thank you for having me today. Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
All right, so I am going to go ahead